Hello, I'm Christopher Walker with Closely Observed English, and in this lesson we're going to look at how to write an essay for the Cambridge First and First for Schools exams. The essay is part one of the writing paper. It's the compulsory task, so it's really important that you know how to write a good essay before going into the exam. The more practice you get, the better you'll do. So let's look at some principles and an example. So first, the nuts and bolts. Read the task carefully. You have to know what you're writing about and what points you must include. Think about how you will address the first 2 points that are given in the rubric, and then think of a relevant third point, but try not to make your point too similar to the other two, or you'll find that you can't write about anything very interesting. Then when you come to write, you need to keep your writing between 140 and 190 words. If you go a little bit over, that's okay. You could probably go up to about 220, but I don't recommend going under the word limit, simply because you'll have too little space to show how good your English is. So before you start writing your essay, you have to think about who the target reader is. Who's going to read your essay? Usually, it's your teacher or your tutor, and the essay is something that you were set for homework. So what does your teacher want? Well, speaking as a teacher myself, the most important thing for me is proof that my students were paying attention in the lesson. But beyond that, I also want to know if my students can think critically and creatively about a topic. They don't have to tell me my ideas again, they can tell me their ideas, as long as they are well argued. So the essay itself doesn't have to be entertaining. It's not a story or a review or an article, but it does have to be well argued. Here's an example task. So in your English class you've been talking about travel. It's a typical kind of topic really. Your English teacher wants you to write an essay. So you have to give all of the points here due consideration. People are travelling more than ever these days, and why do you think that is? So you have to cover to see new places, explain why people travel for that reason, to visit family, you have to explain that reason, and you also have to introduce one last reason of your own. So when you're writing an essay, I always tell my students to get as specific as possible, and to do that, you should think about your own world experience. Do you know anybody who travels? And why do they travel? Why do they always want to go somewhere? If you don't travel much yourself, think about your English teacher. If you go to private lessons, usually your English teacher is from abroad. What brought them to your country in the first place? Why did they come to where they are now? And put that into your essay. And make sure you read the question carefully. So we're not talking about people travelling, but why they travel. So remember that the essay itself is not going to be very long. We're going to say about 200 words thereabouts. You've got to talk about 3 different things and also introduce the topic. So within that limit, it's best not to introduce too many different ideas. If you introduce a lot of ideas but you don't explain them, you don't justify them, your essay won't read very well. It won't be very well argued, and the target reader will feel that they're not fully informed. So the best thing to do is to introduce your main idea connected to each point, and in the same paragraph as the main idea, develop it. Give it a reason. Why do you think this is true? Think of examples if you can. By the time you've done that, you'll have reached about 60 words or so, and it's time to move on to the next point. So for the suggested structure, I would say it would make sense to go for 4 paragraphs with an essay. The first introduces the topic in your own words. The next 2 would develop the ideas you've chosen from the list. And then the final paragraph would include your own idea. This could also include a short conclusion, but that's not necessarily the most important thing. Usually the last point you would have would be introduced through the word finally, for example, and that would then form part of the conclusion as well. So here's an example for you. The first paragraph, as you can see, introduces the topic very clearly so that the teacher knows that you were paying attention to the discussion that you had in the class. After that, we go through each point in turn. So we talk about travelling to see somewhere new. We take the idea from the rubric, but we want to put it into our own words. We get a lot more credit for doing that. We're showing we understand the language this way. Then we have a look at visiting family. And then finally, the point that I chose to include was something from my own experience, which was the idea of travelling in order to work. I don't think it's that easy to work as an English teacher, certainly not English as a foreign language, in England, because we have a pretty good system for doing that in place anyway. But coming to a country like Poland, I feel that I am able to do a lot more in the way of teaching because I can help as a native speaker, certainly in a place that doesn't attract too many of the native speakers. So I kind of use that world experience and put it into the last point. And when we talk about world experience, it doesn't have to be your world experience that you discuss. Remember that the essay has to be well argued, but it doesn't have to be honest or true. If you want to take other people's ideas and express them here, then that's completely okay. So, if we have a look at the different areas that the examiners will be marking you on, the first is content. And if you cover all the content points in the rubric and add as much detail as possible, you should be able to get full marks, 5 out of 5 for this area. Make sure that everything you write is relevant though. It's easy to get distracted by a nice idea when you're writing, but always ask yourself, am I still talking about the same subject? And it's very important that you have a clear understanding of the rubric in the first place. Next, we look at the communicative achievements. To keep the target reader fully informed, you should just limit yourself to one content point idea and develop it as fully as you can, then move on to the next. Don't always go for the easiest idea though. Sometimes when you're brainstorming at the start of a writing session, you come up with things that are pretty obvious. And if you describe them, what you're doing is talking about simple ideas. For at least one of the points, try to go with your second or third best idea. This is likely to be a more complex idea. And for communicative achievement, you do need to introduce some complex ideas. Keep the language neutral wherever possible. You can use slightly interesting language, of course, but as long as it's more formal or neutral. For example, if we have a large number of something, don't say that there are tons of that thing, as if it was a metric measurement. Instead, talk about a multitude of these things instead. Now, in terms of organisation, we've got the paragraph structure already worked out, and then the sequencing words here should really be quite obvious. After the introduction, start with first, then move on to secondly or furthermore, and then conclude with finally. And that will give your paragraphing an additional structure that helps the reader through. Also, it's really important that you don't return to any of your points later to develop them further. This happens as a result of bad planning usually, and I've seen it happen. You get 3 ideas and you write about the first one, then the second one, and then suddenly you go, wait, I had a great idea for the first one, so you put it just here, and it sticks out, it's in the wrong place. It would have been better not to have written it at all, because it breaks up the rhythm of the writing, and this affects how coherent the writing is. And then finally, looking at language, you've got the best chance here to use argumentative language. You need to argue your point, you need to convince somebody that you know what you're talking about. And to be looking at the highest marks here, you need to keep accurate. So be careful when you are using any kind of a noun. It needs a kind of determiner. a determiner could be my or your, it could be a, an, or the, or it could be nothing, the so-called zero article. So what I suggest people do to make sure that they've always got a determiner for their nouns is when you've finished writing, start reading your text again, but from the very end, and read backwards, word by word. And whenever you see a noun, go back a bit further and say, okay, where is my determiner? Have I used one? If it's a singular, countable noun, do I need a, an, or the? Try to use some advanced language wherever possible as well. And it's okay to learn some set phrases that you can apply to your essays. Just try to use them appropriately, of course. For example, you could use the set phrase to a certain extent, which means that this is true but not universally true. So you could say, for example, travellers tend to be motivated by the same thing to a certain extent. And that way you're saying to the reader, I know that it's not always true, but it is mostly true. It's a nice expression. You can use it here, or you could use it in other formal writing. So, in this video, we've considered the question of why people travel. How about you? Have you travelled much? Where have you been? Write your ideas in the comments below, and you'll be helping people to brainstorm ideas for the exam. Travel is a topic that comes up very often, and sometimes it's nice to be able to use other people's ideas in our own language, in our own words, when we go into an exam. So, until next time, thank you very much.